This is a production of Cornell University.
As Don mentioned, I was really lucky in that I got to do part of my Dreer Award plans. I started in January and things only started getting interesting when COVID was starting to get interesting. But I did manage to learn a lot from coffee, and I just want to share some of that with you today. So this was my initial plan. Was my husband and I were going to travel down to Mexico and hopefully meet some farmers who are growing organic coffee. Organic coffee is one of the biggest growing areas of coffee in terms of the market share that it has. And the Mexican farmers have been doing it for many years, and they are probably the most successful organic coffee growers. So I wanted to go and meet them and see what I could learn from them. And like I said, just as we were getting to the southern part of Mexico in Chiapas, COVID was starting to get interesting. The original plan was that we were going to travel to Colombia to meet up with some organic growers there as well. And then we managed to make some contacts in Peru. So we were hoping to get to Peru as well. But what ended up happening was we drove all the way down to Tapachula, which is down in the south, very close to Guatemala. And on March 12th, we decided, you know what, it's getting kind of weird. Mexican government was starting to shut down certain institutions, and things like museums and universities were starting to close, and we didn't want to get stuck. So we decided to head back to the States. And a couple of days later, we were spending the night with a friend in San Luis Potosí, and we heard that the Colombian border had shut down and they weren't taking any travelers anymore to try to keep the virus under control. So we had rented out our Ithaca house. We couldn't come back here. We couldn't get to Colombia, which was the initial plan. So we decided, well, let's just spend some time with my sister in rural Sinaloa, because that sounded like a safer option than coming back to upstate New York, given COVID. So this is a picture of our car in a little town called Hamburgo in Chiapas, which is a couple of kilometers north of Guatemala. So fortunately, before all of this, I took advantage of the SMART program, which is hosted in the Dyson School. And it's a class that happens over winter break, where, as the name implies, student-led multidisciplinary research teams come together and basically do a consulting project for an agribusiness in what they call a developing economy. And with my former office mate, Marie Swetslut, who is a Cornell grad, we organized a trip down there because we thought, oh, well, we can bring relatively low cost, easy soil testing, a little soil package that we put together. We would do a pH test, and we would do an active carbon test, and we would talk to the farmers about how their management of the farms could impact their soil quality. And we met a lovely organization, but sorry, that skipped. But we learned a lot more than we were able to give back to them. And this experience inspired my Dreer trip, in that I wanted to fully grasp what it is that is limiting coffee farmers nowadays. So in case people don't know, I'm going to give a little crash course in what coffee is in the horticultural sense of the crop. So most of what we know as coffee is a species called Coffea arabica, which is pictured here next to my very tall husband. And as you can see, it can grow to be a pretty large bush. It grows up to around 9 meters in the wild. It's originally from the highlands of Ethiopia, where it is an understory shrub, so it grows in pretty dense forests. It doesn't like it too warm, and it doesn't like it too cold. So the temperature ideals range between 15 and 24 degrees Celsius. It definitely cannot stand any frost. And this makes it ideal to grow in the highlands in the tropics. It's also really tied to precipitation in terms of flowering. And an interesting fact, it's an allotetraploid, which means that the species arose as a hybridization event between Coffea canephora, which is another coffee crop that we actually consume, and Coffea euglenoides, which is not a crop. And the result, Coffea arabica, kept 2 complete copies of both of those genomes. It is the only polyploid species in the genus. It is self-pollinating, which makes it relatively easy to propagate. And each flower will produce a drupe, which is what we call the coffee cherry. And then those usually have 2 seeds, which is what we call the coffee beans. And that's what most people are familiar with. It's a very slow crop to grow. So most farmers will start their plants from seed, and it'll take them 6 months between sowing to actually transplanting them in the field. You won't get a first harvest until 2 years after. And then each year after that, you'll get an inflorescence, which takes 9 months to develop into a fully mature seed. So it is actually a really slowly developing crop. And it also means that as a farmer, you need to take care of these seeds for a really long time before you can harvest them. Each plant can live around 20 years, but more intensive management styles will replace plants around every 8 to 10 years. So, like I said, coffee grows in the tropics because of the ideal temperature ranges. And Brazil is the only country that can afford to grow it on flat land. So they have these huge extensions of perfect altitude, perfect temperature, and this has allowed them to have enormous plantations that are completely mechanized and completely, everything is done in a really technological way. So you see monocultures, all the same variety, everything's handled in a very intensive way. But as you can see in the image to the left, that also leads to harvesting that isn't even. So you are harvesting green beans, you're harvesting red beans, and the ripeness of those beans is going to be completely different. And that's why Colombian coffee became so famous, because the topography that the rest of Latin America has, which is these really rough mountains, allows for the right elevation for coffee to grow, but it doesn't allow for mechanization. So you can't have mechanical picking here. Everything has to be done by hand. And what the Latin American countries did is they capitalized on what would have otherwise been a disadvantage, right? So instead of having these very efficient plantations as they do in Brazil, what these countries did was promote the quality of their coffee. However, as I mentioned, everything has to be done by hand. So labor is incredibly important in coffee production. And these are actual pictures of last year's harvest in Colombia from this great article. But I just want to point out that the ripeness of the cherries is very even. What you can see in the basket in the top left is that all the beans are red and ripe. And there's actually some farms where the pickers will paint their thumbnails red so that they can match up the thumbnails to the cherries that they're picking. So this is the organization that we worked with through the SMART programs. Their name is Federación Campesina del Cauca. And they are a second-tier organization that makes up around 700 member families. They are all smallholders, which means that they have relatively small farms. The average farm size in this organization is around maybe 3 acres or 1.5 hectares, something like that. They promote organic coffee as part of their mission to improve the livelihood of local farmers. And they're a wonderful group in that they have really tried to do all of it. They try to work on the growing part of it, on the quality part of it, on the marketing. They've even started roasting their own coffee. And part of the biggest lesson that I got from them is that coffee growers they know what they're doing. They know how to manage their farms, and they know how to make the right decisions for their farms. The one thing that they do not have access to is the market side of it. So they do have a lot of other challenges, and climate change is just exacerbating all of them. And it is incredible to see how aware these farmers are of climate change. There isn't a single farmer I've ever talked to who doesn't mention climate change as the biggest challenge they have. And one of the consequences of this is that the coffee berry borer, which is this tiny little beetle, it likes hot temperatures and it benefits from hotter years in that it manages to produce more and more offspring and have, basically it accelerates its life cycle. So you have more generations happening within a particular time frame. And this is a picture of my hand holding a bean that was infested with them. Their life cycle is very interesting in that they very infrequently mate. Most of their reproduction happens through parthenogenesis. So the females will leave the infected bean only for a very short period of time and will find an uninfected bean, and they bore their way into it, lay eggs, and then die inside the bean. The picture on the right here is a trap where you have soapy water in the bottom of this bottle, and then in the little vial, you have a mixture of ethanol and methanol, which attracts them. And they're not very smart. They just fall in there and die. But they use these traps to keep track of the population sizes. And the only way to manage this bug really is cultural. So you have to pick every single bean that is in the farm. If you let any beans fall to the ground, they will just become breeding grounds for new bugs. Because they spend such a short amount of time outside of the bean, spraying for them is not really an option. So unless your neighbors and everyone in your region is working together to control this bug, it can really become a problem if people leave ripe beans just lying around for them to infest. Another huge issue that coffee growers have is coffee leaf rust, which is a fungus. It is a obligate, oh my God, I forgot the word. They need a living tissue to reproduce. So they will infect the underside of the leaves, and they create these little spots that look like rust, hence the name. And they can propagate ridiculously long distances, and it's really hard to understand what is exactly going to cause an outbreak of rust, so it's very hard to control. There were two particular cases that kind of stand out in the history of coffee rust in Latin America. In 2008, it devastated Colombia, and then in 2011 to 2012, it devastated Central America. And they think that the patterns kind of match up with greater meteorological patterns. So they think that El Nino fluctuations might be involved in spreading the spores throughout the whole region. There's also a lot of influence on the changes between daylight and nighttime temperatures and relative humidity. So unfortunately, climate change is just exacerbating the disease pressure on coffee plants. And a lot of what conventional coffee plantations will have is susceptible varieties. And as you can see on the right, what ends up happening is when you have a really bad infestation, your plants lose all their leaves. They don't necessarily die from it, but your crop is definitely affected for the rest of the year. Working with the FCC, I learned though that the biggest problem that coffee growers have is the fluctuations in the coffee price, because most of the coffee in the world is still being sold through the stock exchange. And that's terribly unfortunate because the stock exchange doesn't really care about the weather or how good the production was in one place versus another. So because of all the financial tools that people use, trading in futures and all sorts of speculation, the price that coffee growers get for their crop is incredibly volatile, and it's really hard for them to plan for the next year. So this graph is showing the prices in dollars per pound that people are trading coffee at the stock exchange. Obviously, the farmers get a fraction of this, and depending on who they sell their coffee to, that fraction can be anywhere from 60% of this price to 90 is the highest that I ever heard. And as you can see, the price increased a little bit during 2012 after the coffee leaf rust devastated Central America. But other than that, it just keeps getting lower and lower. So organizations such as Fair Trade have come together and said, all right, we need to guarantee these farmers at least a minimum price that will cover their production costs. And they agreed on $1.40 as the Fair Trade minimum. However, that only applies to farmers that can afford to sell their coffee to somebody who recognizes that they are following the Fair Trade guidelines. And they have to be certified, and certifications come at their own cost to farmers. If you sell organic Fair Trade certified coffee, then you have a price of $1.70, which is a little bit better. But then you also need to have access to somebody who will buy your coffee as such. So ultimately, it comes down to financial sustainability. If a coffee farmer is not making ends meet at the end of the year, they might be viable for a couple of more years, but they can't keep it up in the long term. So Miguel Gomez at the Dyson School and his team have been working on what does it actually cost to produce coffee, because data are just ridiculously hard to come up with in the first place, but also compare between different systems and different regions. So they teamed up with Fairtrade and the Atkinson Center and did this beautiful project where they tracked how much does it cost to produce a pound of coffee. And they teamed up with these 4 organizations. One was in Mexico, in Honduras, in Colombia, which happens to be the FCC, the organization I worked with, and then one in Peru. And between them, they gathered 2,400 members. That their average farm size was 3.5 hectares, so that's somewhere around 8 acres. This represents a total volume of more than 16 million pounds, which is a lot of coffee. Most of it is certified fair trade, and most of it is organic. So these farmers actually have access to what we would consider the higher end of the coffee price. However, what this study found was that none of these farmers are making enough money to make their farms viable in the long term. This graph shows the costs of coffee production separated from in different categories. So the variable costs are the things that you don't necessarily have to do every time. Things like you might fertilize this year, but not next year, or you may have to invest more in pesticides. The fixed costs are the things that happen every year, things like taxes, labor for the harvest. The depreciation cost includes the cost of, okay, so you buy a tractor this year and then it wears and tears over a year, so it loses value. And then the total costs account for how much it costs to establish the coffee farm in the first place, how much it costs to buy new seeds, things like that that don't necessarily happen all the time, but that ultimately make part of your agricultural business. And then the little red dot in the middle is the farm gate price that these coffee growers are getting. So even though most of these people were selling their coffee as fair trade certified, which would guarantee them that $1.40 minimum, they are not getting that. They're getting a ridiculously lower price. So part of this experience that I've had with coffee is meeting all of these smallholder farmers. And around the world, we're talking about 25 million people who farm less than 10 hectares and usually fall below the poverty line. But many of them have this incredibly strong attachment to their land and their culture. They've been farming coffee for generations. Many can trace their coffee ancestry back to like the 1800s, at least the people I've spoken to in Colombia. So losing their coffee business is more than just losing their cash crop. It's very tied to their identity. And because they are farmers, they're also growing their own food. So even though you don't necessarily put a value on the additional crops that you have, you're still feeding your family off of that. So the value that is, in a way, not monetized is incredible, and it's at risk of being lost. So I used part of the time on the Dreher to participate in this workshop that was organized by the University of Wageningen in collaboration with CIAT, which is a Center for International Tropical Agriculture based in Cali, Colombia. And as you can see, many of you might recognize Alyssa Pritz and Marie Svetslud, who are Cornelians. They brought together these coffee researchers from around the world with different expertise on pests and on marketing and on agroforestry systems. And they wanted to diagnose what is going on with coffee growing and what is going to happen to all of these people and all of these landscapes that are changing. And we identified 6 main trends and research needs for the next decade. So the first thing that we're seeing is that people are substituting their traditional varieties because, like I said, traditional varieties are very susceptible to rust. So if you can have a resistant variety, you are going to simplify your production costs, but also it's going to make your whole farm a little bit more resilient. There's also a big push towards intensification because if you can't reduce your costs, you have to increase your yields to keep financially sustainable. There's also a lot of land abandonment and land use substitution. So you've probably all heard about the Central American migrations that are happening. People are afraid and there's a lot of violence. There's very few economic opportunities, so people are leaving their land. In the case of Colombia, there's huge pressure from illegal crops on the same lands that coffee now occupies. There's also been a lot of expansion of range into higher elevations because of climate change. So as temperatures get higher, people are pushing higher up the mountains, threatening native forests. There was also a couple of countries that had traditionally banned the growing of Coffea canephora, known as Robusta, because it's traditionally known as lower quality coffee, but they are now starting to allow it. And there's also a lot of urbanization as some of these communities get more wealthy, people start leaving the countryside for the city, they decide to build houses on their farms, and so all of this land is being lost. This problem is particularly bad in Costa Rica. I'm going to focus on these 3 trends just because I saw them during my Dreher trip, and because I think they're the more general ones to the whole of Latin America. So there's a huge problem with traditional coffee varieties in that they are a genetic bottleneck. And there's absolutely no disease resistance genes in them. So most of what we know as at least Arabica coffee comes from the few plants that the Europeans back in the probably 1600s took from Yemen and started bringing to their colonies, in particular to Indonesia and to what was Ceylon. And that in itself is already a bottleneck. But then the plants that got to Latin America are just a substitute of that. So all of the varieties that are now grown throughout all of Latin America come basically from the Typica and the Bourbon. And even though there are a handful of other, and people usually will associate the diversity in the bean sizes and colors, which you can see in the left-hand side, with genetic diversity, the truth is that these varieties are very similar to each other. So there's been a huge push for promoting these varieties called Catimors and Sarchimors because they come from a wild hybrid that was found years ago, decades ago, in Indonesia, in an island called Timor, which is a hybrid between Coffea arabica and Coffea canephora. And that hybrid actually has disease resistance genes against coffee leaf rust. So people have been introgressing those genes back into the more culturally acceptable coffee varieties. But there's been a lot of pushback because they are associated with lower quality products. So like I mentioned before, there was a big leaf rust outbreak in Colombia in 2008, where 80% of the coffee was susceptible to rust. And since then, the Federation of Coffee Growers in Colombia has been pushing really hard to get people to plant resistant varieties, to the point where in 2018, 80% of the coffee in Colombia was resistant to rust. So at least that problem's been kind of taken care of. However, in speaking with the farmers, I've learned that they don't particularly like growing these resistant varieties because they have other characteristics. They're harder to pick. The beans feel different, the sizes are different, and there's this myth that the quality is inferior. I do want to take a second to talk about the National Coffee Grower Federation in Colombia. It started as the Union of Coffee Growers, and I want to mention them because they are the only example I know of where there's a strong institution that is taking care of coffee growers in the region. And you can probably recognize the logo. They did an incredible marketing campaign back in the 80s where something like 90% of people in Europe will recognize the logo as a high quality product. And the image in the left is an actual actor this is his real-time job. He is Juan Barrera. He impersonates this Colombian coffee grower and he carries his mule around. And this is at the red carpet party that they held for a movie a while ago called Bruce Almighty, where he actually requests coffee grown in the mountains of Colombia from Juan Barrera. But the reason I bring it up is because it's probably the most successful marketing campaign for an agricultural product that doesn't yet have any added value. Like Colombian coffee is green beans, it's not even roasted. And yet everyone everywhere recognizes it as a high quality product. In fact, I learned recently that in 2005, it was the first non-European product to be granted a protected denomination of origin. So there's essentially champagne and Parmesan cheese, and then there's Colombian coffee, which is really impressive. So there's been another trend in how coffee is grown. It used to be that coffee was grown in the understory of a forest. That's where the coffee plants come from. And so you can have what is known as rustic coffee, where you just have an intact forest that you just grow a couple of coffee plants on the bottom of. But there's been a strong push towards intensification, which is on the lower end of this figure, where you basically have no shade or just a few shade trees. And this comes in part because if you're in the mountains, usually you have a lot of rain. So your plants are going to be light limited. And if you want to increase your yields, the best thing you can do is increase the light access of your plants. However, the more shade you have, the more ecosystem services that you have. So for instance, there's good data that if you have more birds, you're going to have less coffee bean borer pressure. If you have more shade, it's going to reduce the fluctuations in temperature, and so the leaf rust is going to hit your coffee less hard. You can also have additional benefits of nitrogen fixation depending on the trees that you use, of different soil quality, different nutrient cycling. So there's a really strong push, especially from academic circles, for people to grow coffee under some sort of agroforest polyculture system. However, the shift towards growing Robusta coffee is doing the opposite. It's pushing for monocultures because Robusta is a really hardy plant. It is completely resistant to rust. It can take harsh conditions. It can take high temperatures and exposure, and it yields something like twice as much as an Arabica crop. It also has higher caffeine, so it's preferred for processed coffee beverages. So your pre-made Starbucks coffee and your Four Loko and your 5-hour energy drink, all of those caffeine products probably come from Robusta. So when we were in Mexico in the southern part of Chiapas, we met up with this lovely professor at Ecosur, which is their regional university. His name is Juan Barrera, and he works on biological control of coffee bean borer in Robusta plantations. And one of the things that he showed us was the change. So you go from these beautiful forests to a completely exposed field with these enormous Robusta plants. Usually it's the bigger producers that are shifting to Robusta because the increase in yield is just really affordable. But he also told us that the only buyer in the region is Nestle. And that presents a problem for the farmers because they don't trust Nestle. So there's also been a lot of resistance to this. And what Nestle did was they introduced 4 clones of Robusta that they figured were optimized for production. But this makes the farmers really skeptical because they know that they're growing a lower quality product, which they're not going to be able to sell if Nestle one day decides to leave or just to not buy their coffee. We did meet this lovely man called Fidel Lopez, also in the southern region of Chiapas. And he has a completely different story. So he used to grow conventional coffee. And when the coffee leaf rust hit his farm in 2012, he decided he just couldn't afford the pesticides, so he was going to let it go and basically abandoned his farm for a couple of years. And then he came back and he saw his plants, and the way he tells the story is he found these trees that just looked more beautiful than ever. And so he harvested their seeds and propagated them and started his coffee plantation again. And he also decided that he was going to grow organic coffee because it was safer for his family. So like I mentioned, most of these smallholders have farms that are maybe 4 acres, and their farms are on their houses are on them, and their children are playing there. So nobody wants to be spraying pesticides constantly. So for a lot of these smallholder farmers, the organic certification has the appeal that they feel like they're safer and that they're taking care of their little plot of land. He decided also that he was going to start roasting his own coffee and selling it, and he teamed up with his family, and now the whole family runs this little company called Café Horticulture, where they sell the product that they grow. And he says that it's working out really well for him because he's actually making more money. And this is him showing us one of those wonderful trees that he claims has become resistant to rust. He had at least 3 different varieties of coffee. He had one that was produced by the Mexican equivalent to the USDA, which was an improved variety resistant to rust. But the others he had were the traditional susceptible varieties, and he claims he has absolutely no rust pressure in his farm. So one of the latest things that is affecting coffee growers is unfortunately COVID. And this is what the Colombian Federation of Farmers is doing to try to keep people safe. They've taken their traditional logo and transformed it into, on the left to keep social distance and on the right to cover your mouth when you sneeze. I was saying that Colombia expects to have the best harvest ever in 2020, but obviously because the coffee harvest is so labor intensive, they require a lot of migrant workers to come in, and they actually move throughout the whole country. So like I mentioned before, coffee blooms right after the rainy season. And because of the way the winds work in Colombia, there's very discrete rainy season that starts at the beginning of the year in the north and then moves south along the Andes, and then ends at the southern part of the Andes in Colombia at around October, and then will basically shift the rain back north. So the middle of the country has 2 harvests, while the north and the south part have 1. And there's this huge body of migrant workers that just move with the rains following the coffee harvest. And obviously COVID is a horrible risk, because not only are you putting these people in risk, they're just literally moving it across. Another big problem is that because people are leaving the countryside for the cities, it's hard to find laborers. And that's one of the surprising situations in which the very sad situation in Venezuela has proved useful for Colombian coffee growers, and that Venezuelans now make up a big chunk of the migrant laborers that pick coffee. So anyway, that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions. Sorry for the interruption. I don't even know what happened, but.
I don't know where host is, but I'm here. So, I mean, are there questions for Juana?
Juana, this is Marvin. It sounds like with that narrow genetic diversity, the industry is crying out for a breeding program for expanding the diversity of the germplasm. So what's happening around the world with breeding programs?
Lots of things. Well, first of all, there's a lot of people who are interested in the wild coffee species in the forests of Ethiopia, and apparently there's huge pressure on these forests. So there's a lot of concern that the source of all this genetic diversity is being lost because of, deforestation and expansion of the agricultural boundaries and all that stuff. There is a research group from Texas that is working on producing F1 hybrids, which is something that coffee growers, at least to my knowledge, do not work with. Because production costs are so high, what most growers will do is they will propagate their own plants. So you grab your seeds from your plant, from the good plants, and then you start your new plants. If you're working with an F1 hybrid, you need to buy the seed, and that is going to mean more costs for the coffee growers. So I know that they're promoting this in Mexico and in Guatemala. I haven't heard of an F1 hybrid program in Colombia. The FNC, which is the Colombian Coffee Union, they have a research program, and they've just released a new variety. They release varieties, I think, every 5 years or so, and they are very, very specialized in regionally. So they'll release their latest variety. It's called Senicafe 1, but they have a Senicafe for the center, Senicafe for north, Senicafe for south. And so it's very specialized in that sense. There's also, some people will use rootstock, but I've only seen this in big plantations, 300 hectares or more, where they'll use the Robusta rootstock on Arabica scions. And that seems to work really well, at least for disease pressure. I know that they've developed a transgenic coffee resistant to the coffee bean borer, but no one wants to release that, because that immediately means you lose the European market, and no one's going to buy it. So that's a dead end, unfortunately. Yeah, that's all I know of.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Juana? Fascinating look at the place that we don't generally get to. So I always enjoyed your blogs from Colombia and wherever you were.
Thanks, I'm glad.
So I thank you very much for that.
I think there's some questions on the chat.
Okay. Do you know why fair trade guarantees 140, but growers get less than that?
Yes. So coffee is really complex. A lot of growers are really far away, basically, and they need to bring their coffee to an acopio, a gathering, a warehouse where everybody brings their coffee to sell, right? And some people, so the values that I presented here are what's called value at farm gate. So you have to include transportation. And the further you are, the more that is going to cost. In particular, I can speak for Colombia. The roads are terrible. And sometimes the distance might not be too long, but the road is so bad that it takes you hours to get there. So that's a big chunk that gets taken off the price. In addition, most small holders will be part of an organization, and that organization takes its share too. So even though the organization sells the coffee for $140, they don't pay the growers $140 because they have their own operating costs and whatever. In the case of these 4 organizations that were considered in this study, at the end of the year, they'll all get together and they'll decide, all right, how are we spending this extra money that we got from fair trade as their premium? And some will say, all right, we want dividends, or some will say we want some sort of improvement project that benefits the community. So maybe they'll build a school, or they'll build a processing plant, or something like that. Some people will fund extension agents. Some people will fund even scholarships for their members. So it depends a lot on what the organization wants and how they're structured. I also know of Illy, which is a big coffee seller in Europe. They also guarantee that they buy their coffee at $140. But again, this value they came up with it kind of out of nowhere because the costs of production are really hard to estimate. One of the SMART programs that I did was trying to come up with what is this cost of production, and what we found is it's really hard because a lot of rural economy is still very informal. So there are no receipts, there's no keeping track. Farmers don't like to keep track because they don't want to know how much money they're losing. So it's a tricky situation. And if you're such a big organization as Fair Trade, which is in every country and in almost all crops, it's hard to come up with a baseline cost that's going to help everybody. So I hope that answered the question.
There's another question. Have you heard of any progress in the USDA coffee germplasm collection to develop release coffee germplasm with rust resistance and superior cupping quality?
I have no idea about the USDA coffee collection, I have to admit. I did hear that they found rust in Hawaii, which is really sad, but that's all I know, unfortunately. Sorry.
I have a question. I was wondering, this last picture here kind of looks like a very diversified farm. And I was wondering what you think the future holds for doing more regenerative types of agriculture, where more of the ground is actually covered with crops, or if, the future really holds us cutting more and more of our rainforest down, and what the irrigation schemes look like, especially as water becomes more scarce as the water cycle is disrupted.
That's a great question. So one of the things that successful coffee farmers are doing is diversifying, and not necessarily separating their crops, but incorporating everything. So as you can see here, there's pineapples, and then in the foreground there's banana trees and the coffee in the middle. That's a strategy that's proven very successful, more than for, let's say, ecosystem services, for food security, because a lot of smallholder coffee farmers are very food insecure. So a lot of organizations are promoting diversification as a strategy to increase food security, and then it comes with benefits of better soil quality and other things. In terms of more broader scale things, there's a couple of good examples of payments for ecosystem services to coffee farmers in Costa Rica, but they tend to miss the smallholders. It tends to be the bigger farms that can afford to, dedicate half the farm to forest and then get paid for that. If you only have a couple of acres, you can't afford to not farm it all because then you just don't make enough money. So from a research perspective, there is a big push for agroforestry systems in that you have a forest, it serves a function, and you can select species that are valuable for wood. For instance, if you have a bad coffee year, you can cut down your trees and sell them and you're not going to starve. But it's hard because until we start valuing the ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration on a global level, it's just not, no one's going to pay the farmer, and if the farmer doesn't get paid, then ultimately they're not successful. They won't be sustainable.
Thank you.
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, really great presentation, Juana. I don't know where Don went, but I'm here. So I just would thank you for all your work, and hope you're still around. We can talk to you in person, and thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the JER committee.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.